Good evening, everyone. Today's lecture is titled School Age Children, Public Health Perspective in East Africa. And this session focuses on children who are typically between the ages of 5 and 14 years, a stage of life that is often overlooked in public health discussions, yet critically important. School-age childhood is a period of rapid physical growth, cognitive development, emotional maturation, and socialization. It is also a stage where lifelong health behaviors, risks, and protective factors are established. In East Africa, the health of school-age children is shaped not only by biology but also by education systems, family structures, community environments, social norms, economic conditions, and public policy. So, throughout this lecture, we will examine emerging health issues, social determinants, real-world examples, and policy-relevant interventions that affect school-age children in this region. In this section, we are going to define the developmental stage of school-age children. Our focus is on children between the ages of 5 and 9 years, typically those enrolled in elementary education. This stage represents a critical period for cognitive development, social learning, and emotional regulation. During these years, children develop foundational skills such as literacy, numeracy, problem solving, and peer interaction. Growth during this stage is interconnected with earlier childhood experiences and directly influences the transition into adolescence. Importantly, this age group serves as the primary entry point for formal government interventions in East Africa, particularly throughout schools. To understand child health in East Africa, we must begin with demographics. Unlike high-income countries such as the United States, where pediatric populations are relatively stable, East Africa experiences there are different experiences in East Africa. So, East Africa experiences a pronounced youth growth, and in Kenya, approximately 38% of the population is under the age of 15. In Uganda, this figure rises to nearly 46%, while in Tanzania stands at approximately 43%. And these figures illustrate the scale of responsibility placed on education, health, as well as social protection systems. This demographic structure creates both an opportunity for human capital development and a challenge for service delivery. Let us look at evolution of family structures. Family structures in East Africa are evolving rapidly. There is a gradual shift away from traditional extended family networks towards more urban, nuclear, and fluid household arrangements. Single-parent households are becoming increasingly common due to migration, conflict, and economic pressures. We also observe a rise in child-headed households, particularly in post-conflict settings and areas heavily affected by HIV. Another emerging pattern is the skip generation household, where grandparents serve as primary caregivers. And these changes directly influence provision, emotional security, and access to resources for children. Household fluidity has direct consequences for child health. Frequent housing changes disrupt school continuity, weaken peer relationships, and interrupt access to health services. And the changes in caregiver status are often associated with income instability and financial shocks. Emotionally, disruptions in attachment can lead to chronic stress, anxiety, and behavioral difficulties. So, from a public health perspective, instability functions as a risk multiplier rather than an isolated factor. Let us look at assessment of family dynamics. When working with school-age children, public health professionals must assess family dynamics carefully and respectfully. This requires asking open-ended, non-judgmental questions. Examples include asking who currently lives with the child, how caregivers are related to the child, and whether there have been recent changes such as separation or death. It is also essential to determine who holds legal guardianship and who is involved in daily care. These questions help identify hidden vulnerabilities and inform appropriate interventions. Income is one of the most powerful social determinants of health. And in East Africa, rural poverty remains a persistent barrier to school readiness and sustained attendance. Structural inequalities limit access to adequate nutrition, clean water, and sanitation. And chronic poverty also triggers physiological stress responses in children, affecting brain development, immune function, and long-term health. Poverty should therefore be understood as both a social and biological risk factor. This slide introduces the concept of allostatic load and toxic stress. Toxic stress occurs when a child experiences strong, frequent, or prolonged activation of stress response system without adequate support. Elevated cortisol levels disrupt metabolic regulation and impair learning and memory. Chronic inflammation increases the risk of asthma and cardiovascular disease later in life, and immune function is weakened, making children more susceptible to infections. So, these biological effects help explain why social adversity translates into long-term health disparities. Let us go ahead and look at epigenetics, the intergenerational toll. Toxic stress does not affect only one generation. Epigenetics explains how environmental stressors can alter gene expression without changing DNA sequences. And these changes may be passed to offspring, perpetuating cycles of vulnerability across generations. And in high poverty communities, this mechanism contributes to persistent health inequities despite individual resilience efforts. And the public health interventions must therefore focus on breaking intergenerational cycles, not just treating symptoms. Let us look at pediatric risks by income level. This table highlights disparities in pediatric health outcomes by income level. Children in low-income households face significantly higher risks of untreated dental decay, asthma, stunting, and developmental delays. For example, untreated dental decay is more than 4 times higher among low-income children. And these disparities reflect cumulative exposure to environmental, nutritional, and healthcare access barriers. And income, therefore, acts as a structural determinant, shaping multiple health pathways simultaneously. Let us now look at this real-world example, the stunting and cognitive performance. This real-world example illustrates the link between nutrition and cognitive outcomes. In rural Tanzania, nearly 30% of children experience stunting. Stunting is a visible marker of chronic undernutrition and poverty. Research shows a direct correlation between stunting and lower literacy and numeracy scores among children aged 5 to 9. And this evidence underscores the importance of early school feeding programs as both health and education interventions. Child abuse and neglect remain major public health concerns. Abuse includes acts or failures to act that result in physical, emotional, or sexual harm, exploitation or death, and physical and sexual abuse involve direct acts of harm. Neglect, on the other hand, refers to the omission of essential care, including health care, nutrition, and supervision. Emotional abuse includes verbal harm and chronic withdrawal of emotional support. These experiences, these occurrences or experiences have profound and lasting effects on mental and physical health. Let us now look at reporting and barriers in East Africa. Schools play a critical role in identifying child abuse and neglect. However, reporting is often constrained by cultural norms surrounding discipline, and in many rural areas, formal child protective services are limited or absent. As a result, a significant proportion of psychiatric disorders in children are secondary to unaddressed adversity. Therefore, strengthening the reporting systems and community awareness is important. We are now shifting our minds to looking at gendered trauma responses. Trauma responses often differ by gender. Boys are more likely to exhibit externalizing behaviors such as aggression, defiance, and classroom disruptions. Girls more commonly internalize distress, presenting with anxiety, depression, withdrawal, and somatic complaints. Recognizing these patterns help educators and social professional or experts avoid mislabeling trauma-related behaviors. This slide presents a real-world public health example drawn from everyday life in East Africa, especially Uganda. In Uganda, thousands of school-age children rely on boarders or motorcycles, taxis to commute to and from school. This mode of transport is widely used because it is affordable, fast and accessible, especially in areas with limited public transport. However, this practice comes with significant risks. Pediatric road traffic injuries are common, and children are particularly vulnerable due to their smaller body size and lack of protective equipment. The slide emphasizes that high rates of pediatric road trauma represent a preventable public health problem. Injuries sustained during border accidents can lead to long-term disability, school dropout, and in severe cases, death. Public health advocacy is therefore essential. This includes pushing for child-sized helmets, enforcing passenger limits, and strengthening road safety regulations. These interventions are not only about transport policy, but also about protecting children's right to safe access to education. Let us now look at judicial and welfare frameworks. Effective child protection requires strong judicial and welfare frameworks. The priority should be safe family reunification and preservation whenever possible. Systems must address implicit bias in reporting and decision-making. Interventions should focus on family well-being rather than punishment. Training community leaders in trauma-informed care strengthens local response and capacity. Despite adversity, protective factors can buffer children from harm. Teaching self-regulation and problem-solving skills enhances resilience. Stable environments, including safe housing and positive school climates, promote emotional security. Mentorship by non-abusive adults provides consistent support and guidance. Public health strategies should aim to strengthen these protective factors. Let us now look at refugee and internally displaced children. East Africa hosts millions of displaced children fleeing conflict and climate-related disasters. Lack of legal status often restricts access to health care and education. Language barriers further limit school integration. Public health professionals have an ethical obligation to practice cultural humility and inclusive care. Displacement must be addressed as both a humanitarian and a public health issue. Let us now look at health implications of the journey. The migration journey itself poses serious health risks. Children are exposed to violence, separation, and physical danger during flight. Overcrowded transit camps increase the risk of infectious disease transmission. Psychologically, children experience anxiety, fear, and uncertainty regarding legal outcomes. These cumulative exposures necessitate trauma-informed multisectoral responses. Let us look at this real-world example. 3. Education in Bidibidi, Uganda. Uganda's refugee policy allows displaced children to attend local schools. However, overcrowding presents major challenges. In settlements such as Bidibidi, classroom ratios may reach 100 students per teacher. This severely limits the identification of learning disabilities and emotional trauma. The example illustrates how progressive policy must be matched with adequate resources. The science of adverse childhood experiences. On this slide, we are looking at the science of adverse childhood experiences, commonly referred to as SES. Adverse childhood experiences are stressful and traumatic experiences that occur early in life, and extensive research has shown that these experiences are strongly associated with negative health and social outcomes across the entire lifespan. These experiences are not isolated events. They interact with a child's developing brain, immune system, and stress response mechanisms, shaping how the body and the mind respond to challenges later in life. The first category of SES includes physical, sexual, and psychological abuse. These forms of abuse expose children to chronic stress and fear, which can disrupt normal emotional regulation, impair trust in caregivers, and alter brain development during critical growth periods. The second category involves household dysfunction, such as living in homes affected by substance abuse or mental illness. In these environments, children may experience instability, neglect, inconsistent caregiving, or emotional unavailability, all of which contribute to toxic stress. Beyond the household, we also recognize community-level SES, including racism, poverty, and exposure to war or violence. These broader structural and social conditions create environments where children are repeatedly exposed to insecurity, discrimination, and limited access to basic resources. A key principle in the science of SES is that they are cumulative. This means that the greater the number of adverse experiences a child is exposed to, the higher their risk of poor adult health outcomes, including chronic diseases, mental health disorders, substance use, and reduced life expectancy. In public health, this understanding shifts our focus from treating adult disease alone to preventing adversity early in life and strengthening protective systems around children. On this slide, we examine how adverse childhood experiences shape health outcomes across the entire life course, which is why this framework is referred to as the lifespan trajectory of SCES. The central idea here is that early adversity does not end in childhood. Instead, it sets in motion a chain of biological, psychological, and social effects that accumulate over time. The first stage in this trajectory is adverse childhood experiences themselves, such as abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, poverty, and discrimination. These experiences expose the child to chronic and repeated stress during sensitive developmental periods. The second stage is disrupted neurodevelopment. When children are exposed to prolonged stress without adequate buffering from supportive caregivers, the developing brain adapts for survival rather than learning. This affects brain structures responsible for emotional regulation, attention, memory, and executive functioning. As a result, the third stage involves social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. Children may struggle with emotional regulation, interpersonal relationships, concentration in school, and problem-solving skills, which directly affects educational performance and social integration. The fourth stage is the trajectory and the adoption of healthy risk behaviors. So this is the fourth stage in the trajectory. Adoption of healthy risk behaviors. As children grow into adolescence and adulthood, unresolved trauma may increase. The likelihood of behaviors such as substance use, unsafe sexual practices, poor dietary habits, and physical inactivity, often as coping mechanisms. Over time, these behaviors and the early biological changes contribute to the fifth stage, which is disease, disability, and social problems. This includes higher rates of non-communicable diseases, mental health disorders, and unemployment, incarceration, and reduced socioeconomic instability. And the final stage in this trajectory is early death. Research consistently shows that individuals with higher ACE scores have a significantly increased risk of premature mortality driven by chronic disease, injury, violence, and mental health conditions. And this slide therefore also visually reminds us that protective factors can alter this trajectory. Positive influences such as safe and nurturing care, good nutrition, access to green spaces, positive peer relationships, and affordable health care can interrupt or soften the negative pathway created by early adversity. From public health perspective, this lifespan model reinforces the importance of early prevention, sustained social protection, and continuous support across childhood and, of course, adolescence and adulthood. Let us now look at protective factors mitigating damage. After understanding how diverse childhood experiences shape negative outcomes across the lifespan, this slide shifts our focus to protective factors which are critical in mitigating the damage caused by early adversity. Protective factors are conditions or relationships that buffer children from toxic stress, reduce the biological impact of adversity, and promote resilience even in challenging environments. The most important message on this slide is highlighted early. The number one protective factor is the presence of a nurturing, supportive adult in the child's life. This could be a parent, caregiver, teacher, health worker, or a consistent adult who provides emotional safety, stability, and positive guidance. Research shows that even in the presence of multiple SCES, one stable and caring relationship can significantly reduce long-term harm. Protective factors operate at multiple levels. At the environmental level, protection includes safe neighborhoods, access to parks and green spaces, and reliable access to clean water. These conditions reduce daily stressors, lower exposure to violence and disease, and create spaces where children can play, socialize, and develop safely. At the individual level, protective factors include cognitive capacity and emotional regulation. Skills such as problem solving, impulse control, and the ability to manage emotions help children respond to stress in healthier ways and improve academic and social outcomes. At the community level, protection comes from structures such as faith-based support systems, school feeding programs, and community organizations. And these systems provide both material support and a sense of belonging, particularly in low-resource settings. From a public health perspective, this slide emphasizes that intervention should not only aim to reduce risk, but also actively strengthen protective systems. Policies and programs that support caregivers, improve community infrastructure, and enhance school and social services can give significantly other life trajectories. In summary, while SCES increase vulnerability, protective factors create resilience, and investing in them is one of the most powerful strategies in child and population health. Now let us look at school readiness and learning differences. This slide focuses on school readiness and learning differences among school-age children, particularly within the East African context. When we talk about school readiness, it is important to understand that readiness is not limited to knowing the ABCs or base key numeracy. True readiness also includes social and emotional maturity. A child needs to be able to regulate emotions, interact with the peers, follow instructions, and adapt to structured learning environments. Without these skills, academic performance is often affected even when intellectual ability is present. Another critical issue highlighted here is that learning disorders such as dyslexia and attention deficit, hyperactivity disorder, or which you can abbreviate as ADHD, often go underorganized, especially in resource-poor school settings. And many schools lack trained personnel, screening tools, and also sometimes referral systems, leading to children being mislabeled as lazy, disruptive, or slow learners rather than receiving appropriate support. And from a public health perspective, this is not only an education issue, but also a health systems issue. The public health role of integrating developmental and learning screenings into routine primary health care visits. And early identification allows for timely referral, intervention, and support, which significantly improves long-term education and life outcomes for the affected children. Let us shift our minds to bullying and schoolyard violence. This slide addresses bullying and schoolyard violence as a major public health concern among school-age children. Bullying is not a harmless childhood experience. Evidence consistently shows that bullying predicts long-term mental health outcomes, particularly anxiety and depression, which can persist into adolescence and adulthood if not addressed early. One emerging concern in the East African urban context is cyberbullying, which is increasing in cities such as Nairobi and Kampala, of course in other cities. As access to smartphones and social media expands, bullying is no longer limited to the school compound. It now follows children into their homes through digital platforms, making it continuous and harder to escape. This slide also highlights corporal punishment, described here as a persistent form of structural violence. Even where policies discourage physical punishment, it remains embedded in some school and disciplinary systems. Corporal punishment normalizes violence, reinforces fear-based control, and contributes to both physical and psychological harm. So, from a prevention and response perspective, the recommended approach is intervention at the whole school level, and this includes clear anti-bullying policies, teachers training, self-reporting mechanisms for students, parental engagement, and promotion of positive discipline practices. And addressing bullying effectively requires coordinated action across the education, health, and child protection sectors. Let us now look at mental health and the neurodiversity. This slide focuses on mental health and the neurodiversity among school-age children, emphasizing that neurological and emotional differences are part of human diversity and they require appropriate recognition and support within public health and education systems. The first component highlights the autism spectrum. In East Africa, awareness of autism is gradually increasing. However, access to specialized schooling and support services remains very limited. And many children on the autism spectrum are either excluded from mainstream education or placed in classrooms that are not equipped to meet their developmental and sensory needs. This gap often results in underachievement, social isolation, and misinterpretation of autism-related behaviors as discipline problems rather than neurodevelopmental differences. The second component addresses attention deficit or hyperactivity disorder, which you can abbreviate, can abbreviate it as ADHD. In crowded classrooms, particularly those with high student to teacher ratios, ADHD is frequently misinterpreted as bad behavior, disobedience, or sometimes lack of discipline. As a result, affected children are more likely to be punished rather than supported. From a public health perspective, this reflects a systemic failure to screen for it is an indicator of a systemic failure to screen for and accommodate neurodevelopmental conditions within school and primary healthcare settings. The final component focuses on emotional health, especially specifically early onset depression. The slide emphasizes that childhood depression requires clinical recognition and validation, not solely spiritual or immoral framing. While faith-based counseling may produce emotional comfort, it cannot replace appropriate mental health assessment, psychosocial support, and where necessary clinical intervention. Failure to recognize depression early increases the risk of long-term mental health challenges, academic decline, and social withdrawal. Overall, this slide reinforces the need for integrated mental health services, improved teacher training, and routine screening within schools and primary care systems to ensure that neurodiverse children are supported rather than marginalized. This slide addresses vaccination, looks at vaccination, and it addresses its coverage among school-age children, with a specific focus on 5 to 9 year age group, highlighting both the public health importance of immunization and the practical challenges faced in East African context. The slide begins by emphasizing that immunization does not end in early childhood. While much attention is given to vaccines in infancy, the school age period remains a critical window for booster doses and newly introduced vaccines that protect children as they grow and become more socially mobile. One key immunization highlighted is the human papillomavirus, which is abbreviated as HPV vaccine, which in several East African countries is introduced starting at age 9, particularly for girls. This vaccine plays a crucial role in preventing cervical cancer later in life, making it a long-term investment in population health. However, uptake can be affected by misinformation, cultural beliefs, and sometimes limited awareness among caregivers. The slide also notes that the importance of booster shots for tetanus and polio, as immunity from early childhood vaccinations can wane over time. Booster doses are essential to maintain protection, especially in environments where exposure risk remains high due to disease, poor sanitation, or population movement. Finally, The slide also highlights persistent challenges to vaccination coverage, particularly vaccine hesitancy and the last mile logistics. Vaccine hesitance may stem from fear, misinformation, or distrust of health systems, while last mile challenges include reaching children in remote, nomadic, or informal urban settlements. Winch cold chain systems, limited transport, and shortages of trained health workers further complicate delivery. Overall, this slide reinforces the role of public health systems, schools, and community engagement in ensuring that school-age children remain fully immunized, thereby preventing outbreaks of vaccine-preventable diseases and safeguarding long-term health outcomes. Let us look at the double burden of malnutrition. Looking at this slide, you see that it introduces the concept of the double burden of malnutrition, a growing and complex public health challenge in East Africa. The term refers to simultaneous presence of undernutrition and overnutrition within the same population, community, household, or even the same child at different stages of life. The first component highlighted is undernutrition. Many school-age children continue to experience stunting, which reflects chronic undernutrition beginning early in life and persisting into later childhood. Stunting is not merely a problem of height. It is strongly associated with impaired cognitive development, reduced school performance, and lower productivity in adulthood. In addition, micronutrient deficiencies, particularly iron and vitamin A, remain widely spread. The main global spread, and iron deficiency contributes to anemia, fatigue, poor concentration, and weakened immunity, while vitamin A deficiency increases vulnerability or susceptibility to infections and vision problems. The second component is overnutrition, which is increasingly observed among urban and middle-class children, particularly in countries such as Kenya and Tanzania. And rapid urbanization, lifestyle changes, reduced physical activity, and increased consumption of energy-dense, highly processed foods have led to rising rates of overweight and obesity among school-age children. This trend places children at higher risk of non-communicable diseases later in life, including diabetes, hypertension, and cardiovascular diseases. And the third dimension addressed is food security, which underpins both under and overnutrition. Many households rely heavily on low-nutrient staple foods, such as maize and cassava. While these foods may provide sufficient calories, they often lack essential proteins, vitamins, and minerals needed for healthy growth and development. Limited dietary diversity driven by poverty, food prices, and seasonal availability reinforces nutritional vulnerability. Overall, this slide emphasizes that malnutrition in East Africa is no longer a single-sided problem, and effective public health responses must be integrated and balanced to address hunger and micronutrient deficiencies, while also preventing unhealthy weight gain. Yes. So school feeding programs, nutrition education, you can talk of food fortification and policies that promote access to diverse nutritious diets are essential to tackling this dual challenge. Let us look at body image and media influence. Look at that slide. This slide focuses on body image and the growing influence of media on school-age children, particularly within the rapidly changing social and digital environments of East Africa. That's why we are putting our mind. It highlights how exposure to global media is shaping children's perceptions of themselves at increasingly younger ages. The slide begins by emphasizing that globalizing beauty standards, largely transmitted through social media and digital platforms, now affect children's self-esteem very early in life. Unlike previous generations, social-age children today are exposed to curated images, filters, and idealized body types long before they have developed the cognitive and emotional maturity to critically interpret these messages. This early exposure can shape how children perceive their own bodies, worth, and social acceptance. One key issue highlighted is the influence of Western aesthetics on local identity. Media content often promotes narrow standards of beauty, such as lighter skin tones, specific body shapes, and particular fashion styles that may not reflect local cultures or diverse African identities. As children internalize these ideals, they may begin to devalue their own physical appearance, cultural features, or traditional norms, leading to identity conflicts and reduced self-confidence. So, from a public health perspective, this draws attention to the rising incidence of eating disorders and disordered eating behaviors, particularly in urban centers. While historically less documented in East Africa, conditions such as unhealthy dieting, body satisfaction, and extreme weight control behaviors are becoming more visible, especially among children exposed to social media platforms that glorified feminineness or masculinity. Finally, the slides you see here underscore the role of schools in promoting body positivity. Schools are positioned as critical settings for early intervention by fostering media literacy, encouraging healthy self-image, and reinforcing the idea that bodies naturally come in different shapes, sizes, and abilities. Through inclusive curricula, supportive school environments, and a positive role modeling by teachers, schools can help counter harmful media messages and support children's mental well-being and healthy development. Overall, looking at these slides, I see that it highlights body image as an emerging but important public health issue among school-age children, requiring coordinated efforts from educators, health professions, families, as well as policymakers. I'm now going to introduce to you screen time as an emerging public health issue among school-age children in East Africa, trying to recognize that digital technology is now deeply embedded in children's daily lives I will begin by stating clearly that digital technology is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it offers important opportunities for learning and development. On the other hand, it introduces new health risks that were not present for previous generations of children. First, I explain the benefit side. Digital exposure can support digital literacy, which is increasingly essential in modern education systems. Educational applications, online learning platforms, and interactive content can enhance reading skills, numeracy, problem solving, and access to information, especially in settings where physical learning resources may be limited. When used appropriately and under supervision, yes, technology can support school performance and cognitive development. Next, I shift to the risk side, emphasizing that excessive or unsupervised screen time is associated with sedentary behavior. This reduces physical activity, increasing the risk of childhood overweight and obesity. So you see, prolonged screen exposure is also linked to sleep disturbances, reduced attention span, and eye strain. In addition, children may be exposed to inappropriate or harmful content, including violence, sexual material, or misinformation, which they may not yet have the emotional or cognitive capacity to process safely. I then highlight social and media use as a specific concern, noting that platforms such as TikTok and Instagram are increasingly used by children aged 8 to 9 years, despite clear age restrictions. And this early engagement exposes children to adult-oriented content, social comparison, cyberbullying, and unrealistic standards of success, beauty, and popularity. It also blurs the boundaries between childhood and adolescence, accelerating psychosocial pressures. So, from a public health perspective, this slide emphasizes the need for balanced, age-appropriate digital engagement. And the goal is not to eliminate technology, but to promote healthy use through parental guidance, school-based digital literacy, education, school time limits, and policies that protect children online. In summary, this positions screen time as a modern determinant of child health, requiring protective attention from families, schools, health professionals, as well as policymakers to maximize benefits while minimizing long-term harm. Now, let us look at an emerging issue, vaping. On this slide, I'm introducing vaping as an emerging and rapidly evolving public health concern among school-age children, particularly within urban settings in East Africa. I begin by explaining that vaping was initially perceived as a problem confined to high-income countries and adult populations. However, this perception is no longer accurate. Increasingly, vaping is becoming visible within urban youth cultures, especially in cities such as Nairobi, where it is often framed as modern, fashionable, and socially desirable among the younger people. I then emphasize that one of the key drivers of this trend is aggressive and strategic marketing. Vape products are deliberately mapped using bright colors, silly designs, and fruit or candy flavored cartridges, which are highly appealing to children and adolescents. These flavors lower the perceived risk and mask the harshness of nicotine, and trying to it makes the initiation easier for the school age children who would otherwise avoid tobacco products. Next, I address the a critical misconception that fuels vaping uptake. There is a widespread belief that vaping is safer than shisha or cigarettes. While it is often promoted as a harm reduction tool for adult smokers, this framing is misleading when applied to children. Vaping products still deliver nicotine, and which is highly addictive and interferes with brain development, attention regulation, impulse control, and emotional maturity in younger people. And additionally, the long-term respiratory and cardiovascular effects of vaping remain completely understood. I also explain that vaping can act as a gateway behavior, increasing the likelihood that children will later transition to cigarette smoking, shisha use, or other substance abuse or use, And from a life course perspective, early exposure significantly raises the risk of long-term dependencies and, chronic disease. So, from a public health standpoint, I stress that the appropriate response is prevention, not normalization. Public health professionals must actively advocate for strict age verification laws. Also looking at regulation of advertising, bans on child-appealing flavors, and enforcement of sales restrictions. Schools and communities also play a key role through health education that clearly communicates risks and challenges, and challenges misinformation. So, I would like to conclude this this point by telling you that by reinforcing that vaping among school age children, it's not a harmless trend, but a preventable public health threat that requires coordinated action across policy, education, and health systems to protect children during this critical stage of development. Looking at this section, but the slide, I'm now going to focus on gender identity and sexuality as important aspects of psychosocial development during school age years, viewed through a public health lens in the East African context. I will begin by explaining that school age children are actively developing, and they are, an awareness of themselves and others. At this stage, children start to notice differences in gender roles, behaviors, expectations, and social norms. They also begin to form early ideas about identity, belonging, and self-expression. And this process is a normal and expected part of cognitive and emotional development. I will then introduce the issue of comprehensive sexuality education, noting that it remains highly controversial in many East African countries. Opposition often stems from cultural, religious, and societal concerns, with the fear that discussing sexuality will encourage early sexual activity. However, from a public health perspective, the absence of structured education does not prevent curiosity. Instead, it leaves children vulnerable to misinformation from peers, some media, and often the internet. I will emphasize the importance of medical age-appropriate information at the school age level. This does not mean explicit sexual content. Rather, it includes basic concepts such as border awareness, personal boundaries, understanding puberty-related changes, recognizing inappropriate behavior, and knowing when and how to seek help. So, accurate information supports healthy development and reduces fear, shame, and confusion. I would also like to stress the role of safe spaces in children's environments. Schools, families, health facilities, and community programs should provide supportive and non-judgmental spaces where children feel comfortable asking questions about identity, body changes, and emotions. When children are silenced or punished for asking questions, they are more likely to internalize stigma or seek unreliable sources of information. From a public health standpoint, I will highlight that addressing gender identity and sexuality early enough, it contributes to long-term positive outcomes, including improved mental health, reduced vulnerability to abuse, better communication skills, as well as stronger self-esteem. And it also supports prevention efforts related to sexual violence, exploitation, and risky behaviors later in adolescence. I will conclude this slide by reinforcing that the goal is not to impose values, but to ensure that children are protected, informed, and supported as they navigate a critical stage of development. Public health systems must balance cultural sensitivity with the responsibility to promote child well-being, safety, as well as dignity. Let us look at this real world. I understand we looked at it at some point, but we can, in this context, as well look at it. This slide represents a real-world example that illustrates how in Uganda here, thousands of school-age children rely on border motorcycle taxis as their, primary means of commuting and from school. While border borders provide an accessible and, an affordable transport option, they also expose children to substantial, safety risks. And in Uganda here, experience high rates of pediatric road traffic injuries, and children are particularly vulnerable due to their physical size, limited proactive protective gear, and frequent overcrowding on motorcycles. And many children travel without helmets, and when helmets are available, they are often, designed for adults rather than children. These injury patterns are not random. They highlight the role of transport systems and policies. as public health determinants. So, preventing disability and death among school-age children therefore requires more than clinical care alone. From a public health perspective, this example underscores the need for advocacy and prevention-focused interventions, including the prevention of child-sizing abuse, enforcement of strict passenger limits, and stronger regulation of motorcycle transport involving children. Ultimately, improving child safety in this context demands coordinated action across health, transport, and policy sectors. Looking at the life course perspectives, we see that this slide introduces the life course perspective, a key public health framework for understanding child and adolescent health. The life course perspective emphasizes that health outcomes in adulthood are shaped by exposures, sometimes protections, and risks experienced early in life. What happens during childhood does not stay in childhood. It accumulates and influences physical, mental, and social health across the lifespan. And from this perspective, improving child health requires coordinated action across multiple sectors rather than isolated interventions. First, legislation plays a critical role. Laws that protect children from child labor and early marriage help safeguard their physical development, educational attainment, and long-term health outcomes. These legal protections reduce exposure to early trauma and exploitation, which are known risk factors for poor adult health. Second, social services are essential in supporting families. Cash transfer programs and social safety nets help reduce household poverty, food insecurity, and stress. By stabilizing, we see that by stabilizing family environments, these interventions create conditions that support healthy child development and reduce vulnerability to neglect and abuse. And looking at the third one, see that the clinical sector has a continuous role throughout childhood. Routine screening for adverse childhood experiences, or SCE, as we saw earlier, during the pediatric visits allows health workers to identify early signs of trauma and psychosocial risk. So, early identification enables timely, referral and intervention before long-term harm happens. Together, these legislative, social, and clinical actions demonstrate how a life course approach shifts public health from crisis response to prevention, protection, as well as long-term investment in human health. Thank you so much for listening.